Hey, welcome back, APUSH students, to our last lecture for period 2. Today we're going to be looking at colonial society and culture. Our essential question today is 2H. Explain how and why the movement of a variety of people and ideas across the Atlantic contributed to the development of American culture over time. That brings us to key idea number 1. The presence of different European religious and ethnic groups contributed to a significant degree of pluralism and intellectual exchange, which were later enhanced by the First Great Awakening and the spread of Enlightenment ideas. So we're going to see a lot of different groups are going to come to North America. I think a lot of us really get caught up in this idea that it's just British, that we're these British colonies. But it wasn't just the British. Now, certainly we began as major British colonies, but there were also the Dutch in places like New Netherlands, which became part of New Amsterdam, eventually into New York. But over time, a lot of new immigrant groups eventually came there. I mean, if we're looking down over here, we see, Germans, we see Scot-Irish, we see African groups. There's a lot of different groups. Now, do notice that where many of them are settling at are on the frontier in the back country. And so by the mid-1700s, there's a lot of different European groups in the colonial regions, or in the colonies, as that should say. Now, all of these different groups are going to lead to this increase in pluralism, which is just another way of saying diversity. We've got a lot of diversity that's here. Now, different areas had different amounts of diversity. So, for instance, if you're in the South, a lot of plantation owners and the nutrient-rich lands in the East are going to be mostly English colonists. But if you move on to what's called the back country, you're going to see a lot more diversity there. Land's cheaper, it's not as good for plantations. And so we see Irish and Germans, the Scot-Irish, are oftentimes going to live on this frontier, usually near Indians and oftentimes in poverty as well. We can see from this map as well, kind of just defines what some of those are. We see, for instance, the German settlement areas. You see many of them in central Pennsylvania, in central Virginia, in the northern part of South Carolina become really kind of big German areas. And then the Scot-Irish are settling in large parts of northern Virginia, in places such as northern New Jersey, parts of Maine. Are all places where those two big groups, the Germans and the Scot-Irish, which are our two big immigrant groups at the time, are going to be settling. There is also a wide variety of religious groups as well. So many colonies had some degree of religious freedom. Probably the most famous, and certainly the most important, was Maryland's Act of Toleration, which allowed for religious freedom in what would become the colony or the state of Maryland. Now, it provided for all different types of Christian religions, though it did not provide for non-Christian religions. But Maryland was a haven for Catholics. Pennsylvania, which we've already discussed, had religious tolerance, as well as Rhode Island had been set up to also have religious tolerance. A major idea that we need to be aware of, though, is the Great Awakening and the impact that this religious movement has upon the colonists. Now, generally speaking, by the 1700s, church attendance in the colonies had begun to decline, especially in the New England region. And what the Great Awakening is going to be, which happens in the 1730s and 1740s, is going to be led by preachers who are going to use revivals, just like we see revivals in some churches around here, to encourage religious conversion. And it's going to be led by some pretty big names in terms of preachers. Preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield become popular evangelists. We see the painting of George Whitefield there. And they're going to use these fire and passion or fire and brimstone and camp revivals to encourage people to re-examine their faith. Jonathan Edwards gives a very famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he describes that God is holding you over the pit of hell as one would hold a spider. You may end up reading this in your English classes at some point this year. Now, the Great Awakening had some pretty important impacts. It leads to colonists starting to challenge traditional authority. and it really becomes the first national American event. Likewise, the Enlightenment is another major intellectual movement that begins at this time. Now, the Enlightenment, as an intellectual movement, begins in Europe, and you probably learned about the Enlightenment last year in world history. It's going to also, like the Great Awakening, lead colonists to distrust traditional authorities and to think in different ways. Some of the most important Enlightenment thinkers for the colonists included John Locke, who is going to write about things such as natural rights. Natural rights are, he would define as life, liberty, and property. That might sound familiar to you, and it should, because Thomas Jefferson will rip those words pretty much right off of the pages from John Locke and insert them into our Declaration of Independence, though he'll change the last one to pursuit of happiness. And then Montesquieu. Montesquieu is, in his book, The Spirit of Laws, comes up with the idea of the separation of powers, that to be able to prevent a tyrannical government, you should divide it into three separate and distinct pieces, just like ours is today. And that brings us to our second key idea, that the British colonies experienced a gradual Anglicanization over time. Basically, we became more British, and we developed autonomous political communities based on English models with influence from intercolonial commercial ties, the emergence of a transatlantic print culture, and the spread of Protestant evangelism. So we became more English over time. We experienced Anglicanization. So, for instance, the colonial governments, like the ones we talked about, such as the Virginia House of Burgesses on the top and New England town meetings, were often based on English models. In fact, the House of Burgesses is a ripoff of the British system, with the House of Burgesses being considered the lower house, and the King's Council, or the Governor's Council, which would meet in the room in the upper right hand, would essentially be the version of the House of Lords in England. And we had continued trade. This increased contact and familiarity with Great Britain. And that trade was forced upon us. We had to trade with Britain thanks to things like the Navigation Acts. And so we became more familiar with England. Even if all the colonists weren't English, they became more English. Additionally, newspapers helped to communicate similar ideas. Newspapers were huge during this time. This is before the internet and Twitter and television and all these things. And people read all the time. There was dozens of newspapers across the colonies, and these helped to spread similar ideas as people read similar passages. And finally, new ideas were brought from England. George Whitefield, who was one of the ministers during the Great Awakening, comes to England and brings ideas with him. So that ends our lecture for today, and that ends our lectures over period 2. Some big ideas that come from this are these ideas of this increasingly diverse American landscape that includes not only multiple different groups of people, especially new immigrant groups such as the Germans and the Irish, but also new religious and intellectual ideas that help us challenge traditional authority with the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. And finally, that we're becoming, despite our very differences in background, we are becoming more British in a way with our governmental systems, our trade with England, our print culture, and ideas coming directly from England itself. Well, that's all for today. Until next time, go Pack.